307U, Teaching Reading and Listening, Post-Listening Skills and Activities. So far we studied pre-listening and while listening skills and activities. In this presentation, we will talk about the post-listening skills and strategies. You will find the following subtitles during the presentation: reflecting, checking and summarizing, discussion, creative responses, critical responses, information exchange, problem solving, deconstructing the listening text, and reconstructing the listening text. Reflecting. As mentioned before, a listening lesson has three main stages: pre-listening, while listening or during listening, and post-listening. We had studied the first two stages, and now we will discuss the post-listening skills and strategies. Before that, let's look at some other issues related to listening. Sometimes there is a communication breakdown and we need to find out what students found as problematic. This is called troubleshooting. For troubleshooting, we need to find out what causes the problem. The features of pronunciation, unknown or unrecognized vocabulary, speed of the speakers talking, syntactic problems, or word knowledge. Checking and summarizing. Most of the time, for the discussion in language classrooms, students are supposed to answer some pre-prepared questions given by the teacher in small groups or in pairs, because most of the time students are too shy to speak in front of the class, or this gives them more time to express themselves orally. Here, the teacher's role is first to monitor students' discussion in their pairs or small groups, and to check the answers by asking the whole class. The procedure we just described is the most common and the communicative way to deal with post-listening discussion. But is there another way to use as post-listening work? Probably yes. For example, we can have questions based on students' responses, or they can summarize what they have heard, or they can elaborate their summaries, probably by working on the details, because summarizing only deals with the gist of the text rather than the details. In addition to the above-mentioned ideas, there are some other techniques for summarizing as post-listening tasks. For example, in the Take It in Turns activity, one student says one thing about the text, then their partner does the same. Then the first student says a second thing, and so on. So we have the chance to make students speak in a very simple way. The Break It Down activity is a writing task. Here, one student writes a 50-word summary of the text, then he gives to his partner and he shortens it to 30 words. The text then goes back to the original writer and he shortens it to 10 words. This is a very good thinking activity as well. Note comparison asks students to compare their notes they took in the while listening stage, exchange their notes, and share ways to make notes more effectively. Finally, group summary requires group work, as its name offers. After students listen to a text, they get into groups of 4. One student starts writing the summary of what they listened to, writes one word, and gives the paper to another student. He adds one sentence to continue the summary, and so on. In order for learning to occur, we need engaged students, of course. For engaged students, no doubt, we need engaging input. So, interesting texts for listening will help us to have the discussion over the text that is listened to. And most discussion is based on how much the listener's expectations are met. But how can we design discussions as post-listening tasks? There are some techniques for structuring discussions such as sequencing, ranking, grading, saying if something is true or false, or saying to what extent you agree. A more crucial question here is, how can teachers create their own post-listening discussions? As an answer to this question, we have some suggestions. Personalization is one of them. Here we can ask students if they had a similar situation before, in what ways was it different, etc. Also, teachers can prepare a set of questions based on the topic of the listening text. Another way is by giving students some statements about the context of the text and asking students if they agree or disagree with them. Also, the teacher can list some aspects based on the text and get students to rank them in order of importance, desirability, cost, etc. And finally, finding an area of debate about the topic of the text students just listen to, and getting students to discuss pros and cons, goods and bads, benefits and harms, etc. Creative responses are also very important post-reading task tools. And these tasks can be both in written and spoken form, despite the common belief that creativity is reflected through writing. There are some activity types that require creativity. As a technique, genre transfer is one of them. Here, a spoken text is turned into a written one. For example, a gossip can be turned into a news story, etc. Another activity type is moral or headline. Here, students listen to a story and think of either a moral or a headline. We call this kısadan hisse in the famous Turkish saying. In the write-on activity, students listen to a story and then write a continuation. Here, of course, they need to be informed about the main ideas and key features in the text, such as its tone, style, characters, and storyline. These were basically the written activities. We also have some post-listening activities requiring speaking. In the sound effects story activity, students hear some sequenced sound effects. While listening, they note down the verbs that are represented by the sounds. Then they build a story around these words. In the hot seat activity, students listen to a text in which there is conflict. Then one of the students is the protagonist. He sits in the hot seat in front of other students and he is interviewed by them. Finally, the illustrate activity is liked by the children a lot. Here, students listen to a text and then draw an image that represents the text. After that, they explain the illustration for its relation to what they listened to. Critical responses. This concept is directly related to creative responses. In critical thinking, effective questioning is the key. For a critical response to a listening text, awareness of the speaker's viewpoint, biases, and prejudices are the key. But what kind of effective questions can be asked for critical responses? Here are some suggestions. Do I believe the speaker? Do I trust the speaker? Are there any omissions? If so, what and why? Could the speaker have said it differently? If so, how? Would this have changed the meaning? What does the speaker's imagery and use of metaphor show us about their attitude to the subject? Is the speaker's use of language designed to include or exclude listeners? In fact, critical thinking and producing critical responses are taught explicitly to develop students' critical thinking ability. We can ask students to agree or disagree with the speakers, probe the speaker's intentions, distinguish between facts and opinions, not test the persuasion techniques, etc., as a way to increase critical thinking. Information exchange activities are very important post-listening tasks, since they allow even societies to develop through sharing of information and interpretation. But sometimes we may be overemphasizing the exchange of unimportant information, which leads to trivialization of learning and learners. A very good way of exchanging information as post-listening activities is the use of the jigsaw technique. In the jigsaw activity, one student listens to a recording of part of a story, while a partner listens to another part. Then they're supposed to share the information they have and achieve the whole text. Another version of the jigsaw technique is the news jigsaw. Here, each student listens to a different news broadcast and discuss the news with their partners in terms of differences, the importance of the news, etc. Problem-solving activities are also good post-reading opportunities. Some suggestions as problem-solving tasks are as follows. Listing. For example, list all the ways to keep fit. Sorting. For example, put the food types into groups. Ranking. For example, say which is the best, the second best, the worst, etc. Ordering according to criteria. For example, say which is the heaviest, prettiest, the most expensive, etc. Designing something. For example, how can it be designed to fit the criteria? Solving moral dilemmas. For example, what should they have done? What would you do? And finally, solving mysteries. For example, who was the killer? How did he succeed? Etc. Deconstructing the listening text. Sometimes we can examine listening texts for their salient features such as grammar, vocabulary, cohesive devices, discourse markers, pronunciation, etc. And there are two main ways to do this. The first is to play short segments of the recording and stopping them. In this way, they are able to deal with the information when it is in their short-term memory. The other way is to use a transcript, but we should make sure that students do not have access to the tape script, because the activity then turns into a reading task. Some reasons to exploit transcripts. Although some teachers believe that transcripts are not for listening, but they facilitate cued reading, there are many good reasons to exploit them. As you see in the table, they can be used for pronunciation, to elaborate elision, contraction, assimilation, and other aspects of connected speech, sentence stress, intonation for mood and attitude, etc. They can also be used for speed, to elaborate where and why speakers speed up and slow down. Also for vocabulary, to elaborate if students relate the written form to the sound of the word in connected speech or not. Features of good listeners are also elaborated through back-channeling. I see kind of expressions. Some features exclusive to speaking, like fillers, false starts, hesitations, repair strategies, incomplete statements, etc. are also elaborated. Discourse markers are also studied through an elaboration of signals for speech functions such as changing the subject, softening an opinion, returning to the main point, etc. Finally, graphophonic relationships between words are also studied by elaborating words that are related in spelling and meaning but differ greatly in sound, like syllable shifts, silent letters, etc. Like, for example, we have sign and signal, suspect and suspicious, nation and nationality, know and knowledge, etc. Students can not only deconstruct the texts, but they can also reconstruct texts. They can do this through dictogloss and writing keywords to reconstruct the text that we discussed in earlier presentations. Plus, there are some other ways to do this. For example, gap fill is a very common technique. Here, students complete the gaps in the texts given. In another reconstruction activity, students use a computer program called Storyboard. In this program, students listen to a text, then they are given the blanked out version of the text. Then students are supposed to type words that they remember during the listening stage. In the disappearing dialogues activity, the teacher elicits and writes the dialogue or uses a prepared dialogue. Then students practice in pairs. Once they are comfortable with the dialogue, the teacher disappears some parts, then continues disappearing more. Then the teacher and students rebuild the dialogue together to finish. Finally, in the reordering activity, the teacher cuts the script into strips. After the while listening activities, students put the scripts into correct order. In this presentation, we focused on post-listening activities in the following areas: importance of using post-listening, checking and summarizing, discussions, creative responses to listening texts, importance of critical responses, information change activities, using listening for problem solving, deconstructing the listening text, and reconstructing the listening text. In the further presentations, we will be dealing with the importance of preparation and planning in teaching listening.